Good morning everybody and welcome. I'm Trevor and today we're at the Tamar Lakes on the Devon and Cornwall borders for some bird watching, and also we'll be doing a tutorial for beginners on how to photograph birds. So this is going to be our office for the day, so we're going to get inside and get comfortable and get set up. So here we are, we're all set up in the hide, and the reason I've chosen this location today, the Tamar Lakes, is there's a good variety of birds here, and they do have some feeders out which are fairly regularly topped up, so we get a good variety of birds, mostly a lot of the birds that you'll see in your own gardens, and that's probably the best place to start photographing birds, is your own garden. The birds will be used to you when you go out feeding them, and sitting quietly, they can come quite closely. So that's probably the best place to start. And you can set up your own perches and look out for the birds' behaviour, because most often than not they'll land on the same perch, so you can get good photos of them. But here it's a little bit cluttered, but I'm not going to start messing about with perches and everything else here, so we're just going to leave it as it is. And yeah, we've also got one of Britain's rarest birds here, and that's the Willow Tit, so we're hoping to catch that one as well. So how do we take pictures of birds? It might seem like a silly question, and a lot of people will say, well, you just point and shoot, which is absolutely fine in a lot of cases. You just might be taking record shots. But you might be a more experienced bird watcher who's just got into photography and wants to make the pictures a little bit better quality, a bit sharper. So first of all, the equipment. Ideally, you'll be using a DSLR camera, and there's quite a few on the market, but the main ones are Canon, Nikon, Panasonic, Sony. They're the main players really, and it doesn't have to be a top-end camera. It can be an entry-level camera which will work just fine, but ideally you want to have a mid-range camera. For example, I use Canon, and the Canon 90D is a fantastic camera if you're starting off in bird photography. I'm using the Canon 5DS, that's just my preference. But yeah, a mid-range camera is probably the ideal starting point. So then we come on to lenses, and there are a multitude of lenses available on the market. But ideally for bird photography, you want to have a minimum of 300mm, preferably 400 if you can. And also image stabilization or optical stabilization is a real plus point. It means if you're shooting handheld, it'll keep the picture fixed. Today I'm using a tripod, and I'm also using a Sigma lens, which is 150 to 600mm, and it is fantastic value for money. It takes some really good pictures. So what settings do I use? Well, it doesn't have to be as tricky as it sounds. There are three main settings that people use on DSLRs, which is aperture priority, shutter priority, and full manual mode. And if you put a group of wildlife photographers in a room, I would bet that 80% of them use aperture priority, which is what we'll be doing. Now, the aperture priority means the aperture is basically how much light is let into the camera sensor, and it's a circular set of blades which open and shut, and it depends on what setting you have, and they're also called f-stops. So you have a wide aperture, which is a lower number, for example f2.8, which will give you a wide opening which lets in more light, and then it will go up the range, for example to f11, which will give you a smaller aperture which lets in less light. So when you're on Aperture Priority and you're on a wide open aperture, for example of f5.6, you don't have to worry about any of the other settings. If you set the ISO setting to auto, the camera will take care of the shutter speed and also the ISO as well. And the ISO is the light sensitivity, but we'll go through that in a later tutorial in more detail. So if you're shooting wide open at f5.6, your subject is going to be at the foreground. It will be much more in focus, whereas the background will be more blurred. If you're shooting at a narrow aperture of say f11, then the subject will be in focus, but also the background will be more in focus as well. It doesn't quite give you the same effect. It's not as pleasing. So a wide open aperture for bird watching is more ideal. And lastly, the only other thing we have to worry about is focusing. So you'll set your lens on autofocus and your camera on continuous focus. And also you'll set your focus point to a single focus point. That will give you a better fix on the bird, especially if you're shooting through trees and branches. You can get a much better fix on the bird. So we're ready to start shooting, and the first thing to do is always aim at the bird's head, and preferably the bird's eye. The eye needs to be bright, needs to be sparkling. One tip to take on board is avoid taking photos of the birds on feeders. They can just look unsightly and a bit cluttered. It's always better to get them on their natural perches. It's much more pleasing. But it's been really busy. Yeah, we've had a lot of birds there this morning, and we've seen the Willow Tit, and which is great because the Willow Tit is a bird that's well, it's the second most declined bird in Britain behind the turtle dove. It's suffered a 94% decline since the 1970s, and mostly due to its loss of habitat. It's a very particular bird. It likes damp woodland. It won't use nest boxes, and it excavates its own hole in rotting tree stumps. It gets predated by great spotted woodpeckers because they can easily get into the damp wood. So it's really up against it. So it's really good to see them here. But we've had jay, magpie, chaffinch, blue tit, great tit, a wren which is just singing to me, blackcap. We've had coal tit, marsh tit. It's been really good. So there we are. I hope you enjoyed that little tutorial. I hope you found it useful. And the most important thing is to keep on practicing and enjoy it. If you've got any questions, please leave them in the comments. I'll always get back to you. And we'll be running some more tutorials in the future, along with some treks, of course. And if you'd like to, please subscribe to the channel. And I hope to see you again real soon. Thanks again.